Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
So it's the morning of August 6, 1945.
Right.
A communications officer is sitting at his desk at the Japanese Imperial Headquarters in Tokyo. Routine reports are coming in from all across the country. I mean, the war situation is absolutely dire at this point, but the military bureaucracy, it's still functioning.
And then this really strange anomaly occurs. Every single telegraph line, every radio frequency, and every telephone connection to the city of Hiroshima just simply goes dead.
All at once.
Yeah, completely simultaneously. And it is not static. It's not a garbled transmission. It is just complete silence. They can't reach the army command there. They can't reach the naval station. They can't even reach the local civilian switchboards.
And that kind of silence was entirely unprecedented. I mean, the Japanese military had experienced massive conventional bombing raids for months by this point. But those raids, they always left some fragmented lines of communication open.
Right, a whole city doesn't just vanish from the grid in a single instant.
Exactly. So to understand what caused that silence, the High Command actually had to dispatch a young staff officer in an airplane to fly southwest just to see for himself.
He flew for hours, completely confused by the lack of any radio chatter from the entire region. And when he was still nearly 100 miles away from the city, he saw it.
A massive churning cloud of smoke and debris.
Yeah, and beneath it, where this major regional military and industrial hub used to be, there was just a burning scar on the earth.
Which brings us to the mission for this deep dive. Today, we are going to meticulously examine the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945.
To do this, we're pulling from a really substantial stack of historical documents. We've got the declassified scientific and administrative reports directly from the Los Alamos National Laboratory.
We also have former Secretary of War Henry Louis Stimson's 1947 article, which detailed the internal decision-making process of the Truman administration.
Right, and we are pairing those with the extensive post-war casualty records and survivor testimonies. Because the goal for you listening isn't just to recount the dates and the death tolls.
No, we really want to unpack the massive scientific hurdles that made these weapons possible in the first place, the diplomatic breakdowns that preceded their use, and the ground-level human experience of the survivors.
Not to mention the really complex historical and legal debate that has waged ever since. So to start, we really need to look at the specific military and strategic reality of the Pacific War by the summer of 1945.
That is exactly where we have to begin. We cannot discuss the atomic bombs in a vacuum, because by that summer, the conflict between the Allied powers and the Empire of Japan had descended into this state of absolute, unyielding friction.
The precedent for mass urban destruction, it had already been firmly established by conventional bombing campaigns.
Right, because before we talk about a single bomb destroying a city, we really have to talk about thousands of bombs destroying a city.
Specifically, the firebombing of Tokyo.
Yes, Operation Meeting House, which took place in March 1945. The shift in American aerial strategy there is a critical baseline for this whole discussion.
Because earlier in the war, the United States Army Air Forces had been attempting high-altitude precision bombing over Japan, right? Targeting specific factories, specific military installations.
They were, but it was largely ineffective. The high-altitude jet stream over Japan basically just scattered the bombs.
Right. The crosswinds were just too strong.
Exactly. And the cloud cover obscured the targets constantly. So General Curtis LeMay shifted the strategy entirely. He ordered low-altitude nighttime raids using incendiary weapons.
And the physical reality of those weapons is terrifying when you look at the specs. These armadas of B-29 Superfortress bombers, they were dropping these things called M69 incendiary clusters.
Which were essentially pipes filled with napalm.
Yeah, they would scatter, crash through the roofs of Japanese houses, which, we should note, were predominantly constructed of wood and paper and just ignite.
The Tokyo raid of March 9 and 10 normalized a level of destruction that is really difficult to fully grasp. The fires from the incendiaries coalesced into a massive firestorm,
generating these gale-force winds that literally suck the oxygen out of the air.
In a single night, an estimated 100,000 people were killed, and roughly 16 square miles of the city were just incinerated.
Which brings up the whole concept of total war. I mean, the ethical lines of warfare had already shifted drastically before the atomic bomb was even tested.
Oh, absolutely.
When you look at the sheer scale of those conventional firebombing campaigns, it really pushes a question. Had the threshold for civilian casualties already been stretched to its absolute limit before Hiroshima?
Well, the doctrine of total war was fully realized by that point. Under this doctrine, The entire industrial and civilian infrastructure of a nation is considered a legitimate military target because it actively supports the war effort.
And in Japan, that industrial production was heavily decentralized, wasn't it?
It was. You had these very small workshops located right in residential neighborhoods that were producing aircraft parts, munitions, things like that.
So military planners argued that destroying those neighborhoods was a military necessity.
Yes, and former Secretary of War Henry Louis Stimson argued exactly this point in his 1947 article. He stated that the atomic bomb was viewed by the administration as a legitimate military weapon.
Its primary purpose, in his view, being to bring the war to an expeditious end.
Exactly. And to prevent the massive casualties that they expected from a ground invasion of Japan.
Because the alternative to the bombing campaigns was Operation Downfall.
Right, the proposed Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands.
And the plans for Downfall were staggering in their scale. It was divided into two phases. You had Operation Olympic, which targeted the southern island of Kyushu, and then Operation Coronet, which targeted the Kanto Plain near Tokyo.
And the estimated Allied casualties for this invasion ran into the hundreds of thousands, if not over a million.
Meanwhile, the Japanese had their own defensive plan, Operation Ketsugo. And this was basically a strategy of absolute attrition.
They mobilized the entire population to fight to the bitter end. We're talking about civilian militias armed with bamboo spears who were mandated to defend the beaches.
The Japanese military leadership, they knew they could not win the war in a conventional sense by 1945.
No, but they believed they could make the invasion so incredibly bloody that the United States would sue for a negotiated peace rather than demand unconditional surrender. And that is the core of the psychological shift we see in the American leadership. Stimson framed the atomic bomb not just as a weapon of physical destruction, but fundamentally as a psychological weapon.
Because, as you said, destroying a city was not a new concept to the Japanese high command. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, they had all already been largely burned out.
Right. So the American leadership believed they needed an overwhelming, completely unprecedented shock to break the political deadlock within the Japanese government.
A government which was heavily dominated by military hardliners who flatly refused to capitulate despite all that conventional destruction.
Exactly.
But to understand how this psychological weapon actually became a physical reality, we have to look at the science. We have to look at the immense industrial effort required to build it.
Which brings us to the Manhattan Project.
Specifically, that 27-month period of really intense collaboration at the Los Alamos National Laboratory.
Spearheaded by physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves. And the scientific and logistical hurdles they faced were immense.
They weren't just trying to build a bomb, they were trying to build a completely new type of physics package from scratch during wartime.
With materials that barely even existed on Earth at the time. They were dealing with two entirely different fissile materials. You had uranium-235 and plutonium-239.
Let's break those materials down for a second, because this really dictates everything about how these bombs were built. So natural uranium is mostly uranium-238.
Right, which does not sustain the kind of rapid chain reaction needed for a bomb.
The isotope they actually needed, uranium-235, makes up less than 1% of natural uranium.
So separating that tiny fraction of U-235 from the U-238 was just a colossal industrial challenge because they are chemically identical. You can't just separate them with a simple chemical reaction.
You have to separate them based on their very slight difference in weight.
Yes, which required building these massive facilities at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, using electromagnetic separation and gaseous diffusion. I mean, it consumed an enormous percentage of the entire electrical grid of the United States just to produce a few dozen pounds of this enriched material.
And because they were unsure if they could produce enough uranium-235 in time, they simultaneously pursued plutonium,
which is a completely artificial element created in nuclear reactors, specifically at Hanford, Washington.
So it is kind of like an engineering team being ordered to build two completely different types of engines from scratch at the exact same time, simply because they do not know which type of fuel will actually be delivered to the factory floor.
That dual-track approach led to a massive crisis in the design phase. Initially, the scientists planned to use a gun-type assembly for both the uranium and the plutonium.
The concept there was relatively straightforward, right?
Relatively, yes. You take one subcritical piece of fissile material, and you literally fire it down a barrel into another subcritical piece. When they combine, they form a supercritical mass, and that initiates the nuclear chain reaction.
And that gun-type design for the uranium, that eventually became the little boy bomb.
Yes. But when they tested the first samples of plutonium that came out of the Hanford reactors, they discovered a catastrophic problem. The plutonium contained an isotope, plutonium-240, which underwent spontaneous fission at a very high rate.
Okay, let's unpack this for a moment. Spontaneous fission means the material is basically throwing off neutrons on its own without being triggered, right?
Precisely. So if they tried to use the gun-type design for plutonium, a design they had codenamed Thin Man, the spontaneous neutrons would start the chain reaction, while the two pieces of plutonium were still moving toward each other inside the barrel.
Ah, so the reaction would start too early.
Way too early. It would generate intense heat and blow the weapon apart before a full nuclear yield could be achieved. In nuclear physics terms, this is known as a fizzle.
So it would just be a messy, highly radioactive conventional explosion, but not an actual atomic blast.
Exactly.
So the Thin Man design is a complete failure at this point. They realize they cannot use the gun method for plutonium.
And what's fascinating here is how bureaucratic and resource pressures drove the scientific innovation.
Yeah.
General Groves, who was managing the entire Manhattan Project, he absolutely refused to abandon the plutonium track.
Because the United States had already invested immense time and money into it.
Yes. The manpower poured into those massive plutonium production reactors at Hanford was staggering. Abandoning it was politically and administratively unacceptable to Groves. He demanded that the scientists find a way to make the plutonium bomb work.
Which forced the scientists at Los Alamos to pivot to a highly complex, radically different method.
The implosion design.
Right, which became known as Fat Man. How did the implosion method actually work compared to the gun method?
Yeah, the implosion method required taking a subcritical sphere of plutonium and compressing it inward using conventional explosives. By crushing the sphere, you increase its density to the point where it suddenly becomes supercritical.
But that requires absolute precision, doesn't it?
Perfect precision. The conventional explosives had to be arranged in complex lenses around the core, and they had to detonate simultaneously with microsecond accuracy.
What happens if they don't?
If one side detonates a fraction of a millisecond too late, the plutonium would just squirt out the side like toothpaste from a squeezed tube, and again you would get a fizzle.
So because it was so incredibly complex, and because the physics of explosive lenses had never been attempted on this scale before, they had to test it.
They could not just drop it from an airplane and hope it worked. This absolute necessity led to the Trinity test on July 16, 1945.
And that test took place in the Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico. They hoisted a plutonium implosion device, which they simply called the Gadget, to the top of a steel tower.
The tension was palpable. There was a severe thunderstorm the night before, which was threatening to delay the test or even cause a misfire in the electrical circuits.
But the weather cleared just enough, and at 5:30 in the morning, they triggered the firing circuit.
The result was an explosive force equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. The flash illuminated the surrounding mountains brighter than daylight.
And the heat vaporized the steel tower completely, didn't it?
Completely. It left a crater of fused green glass in the desert sand. The mushroom cloud rose to 40,000 feet. So, the implosion mechanism was decisively proven.
But here is a detail that I think often gets overlooked. The Trinity test proved the Fat Man plutonium design. But the little boy uranium bomb, the one they actually dropped on Hiroshima, that was never fully tested before it was used in combat.
That is correct.
Testing the uranium bomb would have used up essentially all the highly enriched uranium-235 that the country had painstakingly produced over the previous 2 years.
They simply did not have enough material for a test and a combat drop.
It just seems like an enormous risk to drop an untested weapon into a combat zone.
It was a risk, but the scientists considered the gun-type design of Little Boy to be a mathematical certainty.
Because it was so mechanically simple compared to the implosion lenses?
Right. They had tested the individual components, the ballistics of the gun barrel, the conventional propellants, and they were confident the nuclear physics would work without requiring a full-scale integrated test.
So by mid-July 1945, the weapons are successfully engineered. One is proven by a physical test, the other is proven by mathematics.
And the focus then shifts rapidly from the deserts of New Mexico to the diplomatic stage.
And specifically to the final warnings given to Japan. On July 26, the Allied leaders issued the Potsdam Declaration.
The Potsdam Declaration was a stark, uncompromising ultimatum. It was issued jointly by the United States, Great Britain, and China. It demanded the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces.
It outlined the terms for the occupation of Japan, the stripping of its empire, and the prosecution of war criminals.
Most importantly, it concluded with a warning that the alternative for Japan was prompt and utter destruction.
But notably, the declaration did not explicitly mention the atomic bomb.
No, because it was still a closely guarded military secret.
And it also didn't clarify the future status of the Japanese Emperor Hirohito, which is crucial because the emperor's status was the single most vital issue for the Japanese leadership.
They viewed the emperor not just as a monarch, but as a living deity. He was the soul of the nation.
So the Japanese response to the Potsdam Declaration becomes this critical and really somewhat tragic juncture in diplomatic history.
On July 28, Japanese Premier Kantaro Suzuki held a press conference to address the ultimatum. When asked by reporters about the government's stance, he used the Japanese word mokusatsu.
And this one word has been analyzed endlessly by historians and linguists ever since.
It is a word with incredibly complex ambiguity. It translates roughly to treating something with silent contempt or dismissing it as unworthy of public notice.
But it can also simply mean to withhold comment for now, right?
Yes, exactly. Suzuki was under intense pressure from the military hardliners in his cabinet, who wanted an outright rejection of the declaration. So he may have used mokusatsu to appease them, while simultaneously buying time to seek a mediated peace through the Soviet Union.
But nuance does not translate well in wartime diplomacy. When the international press picked up the statement, it was widely reported as a flat rejection.
A declaration that Japan was ignoring the ultimatum with contempt.
And according to Stimson's documentation, in the face of this highly public rejection, the United States felt it had exhausted all diplomatic avenues.
The administration concluded it could only proceed to demonstrate that the ultimatum meant exactly what it said. The machinery of the Manhattan Project transitioned from development to deployment.
Before they dropped the bombs, there was the matter of target selection. This was handled by a specific target committee composed of military officers and Manhattan Project scientists.
And they were not just throwing darts at a map. They had very specific criteria.
They were looking for large, intact, urban areas.
The selection criteria were deeply pragmatic. They were focusing on maximizing the psychological impact and the scientific measurement of the blast.
So they wanted cities that had not yet been extensively destroyed by conventional firebombing.
Right, because if you drop a new weapon on a city that is already 80% ash, you cannot accurately measure the devastating effects of the new device. You need pristine buildings to properly measure blast pressure and thermal damage.
Which is just a deeply calculating way to view a city full of hundreds of thousands of people.
It is. Kyoto, the ancient cultural capital of Japan, was actually originally at the top of the target list.
Because of its size.
Because of its size, and also because of its surrounding mountains, which they calculated would focus the blast wave and increase the damage.
But Secretary of War Stimson personally intervened and struck Kyoto from the list.
Yes. Stimson had visited Kyoto in the 1920s. He understood its cultural and religious significance. He argued that destroying Kyoto would create such enduring bitterness that it would make the post-war occupation and reconciliation with the Japanese people completely impossible.
But General Groves fought hard to keep Kyoto on the list, didn't he?
He did. He wanted that target. But Stimson pulled rank. He took the issue directly to President Truman, who agreed to remove it. So Hiroshima, which was a major military headquarters and embarkation port, moved to the top of the list.
Concurrently with these final preparations, the United States military was dropping millions of warning leaflets over various Japanese cities. These were often called lame leaflets.
They listed multiple cities, warned that some of them would be destroyed by air attacks, and urged civilians to evacuate.
The psychological warfare branch of the military considered this a standard procedure, basically to undermine civilian morale and disrupt wartime production by causing mass flight from the urban centers.
Right.
But I have to push back a bit on the idea of these leaflets as a genuine diplomatic tool or some meaningful humanitarian gesture.
How so?
Well, in a society operating under strict military censorship and total war conditions, where the secret police strictly controlled movement and the populace was restricted from taking individual action without severe punishment, was dropping leaflets a genuine attempt to save civilian lives? Or was it just a bureaucratic box-checking exercise so the military could later claim that a warning was given?
You are right to question the practical efficacy of the leaflets. It is the subject of intense historical scrutiny. Given the realities of wartime Japan, the average citizen could not simply abandon their assigned wartime job and flee to the mountains based on an enemy leaflet.
They would be arrested for desertion or treason.
Exactly. Furthermore, the leaflets did not warn of a fundamentally new type of weapon. They warned of continued bombing, which the civilians were already enduring daily. To contextualize this diplomatic breakdown, we really have to look at the rigid, uncompromising positions held by both sides.
Right. There was just no room for maneuver.
The Allies were absolutely steadfast in their demand for unconditional surrender. This was a policy established much earlier in the war by President Roosevelt at the Casablanca Conference.
The goal being to ensure the complete undeniable dismantling of the Axis regimes.
Preventing any possibility of a negotiated armistice that might allow a resurgence of militarism in the future. They did not want a repeat of the end of the First World War.
And on the other side, the Japanese military leadership, the hardliners on the Supreme Council, they steadfastly refused to capitulate.
Their strategy was to bleed the Americans in a ground invasion to secure better peace terms, specifically the preservation of the imperial system and the avoidance of war crimes trials.
And Stimson noted in his writings that he believed Japan possessed liberal leaders who might seek peace, but they were entirely submerged and neutralized by military figures he characterized as terrorists.
That diplomatic failure, that complete inability to find any middle ground, set the stage for the first of the two devastating strikes. We move to the early hours of August 6, 1945.
The mission was carried out by the 509th Composite Group, which was a specialized unit formed specifically to deliver atomic weapons. They were stationed on the island of Tinian in the Marianas.
And the B-29 bomber assigned to the primary strike was named the Enola Gay, piloted by the group's commander, Colonel Paul Tibbets.
The payload was the Little Boy uranium bomb, and the logistics of just loading this weapon were formidable. It weighed 9,700 pounds. It measured 10 feet in length and was over 2 feet in diameter.
The Enola Gay had to be heavily modified. It was stripped of its armor and most of its defensive gun turrets just to save weight so it could safely lift off the runway with that massive payload.
Okay, let's unpack the timeline of the drop, because the mechanics of this are really chilling in their precision. The Enola Gay flew toward Japan, accompanied by observation and instrumentation planes.
Ahead of them, a weather reconnaissance plane named Straight Flush flew over Hiroshima and radioed back that the cloud cover was minimal. The primary target was clear.
At 8:15 in the morning, the Enola Gay reached the release point over the city. The bombardier took control of the aircraft and dropped Little Boy.
The bomb fell for 43 seconds, and it was intentionally set to detonate not on impact with the ground, but at a specific altitude.
When you look at the sheer physics of the blast, it is staggering. The bomb detonated at an altitude of approximately 580 meters, or 1,900 feet, directly over a hospital, the Shima Surgical Clinic.
This mid-air burst was not an accident.
Mm.
It was calculated specifically to maximize the blast radius.
How does that work exactly?
Well, if a nuclear weapon detonates on the ground, a massive amount of the energy is just absorbed by the Earth excavating a crater.
Right.
By detonating it at 1,900 feet, the blast wave travels outward and downward. When the primary blast wave hits the ground, it reflects upward and outward, merging with the incoming wave to create a phenomenon called a Mach stem.
And that significantly amplifies the destructive horizontal pressure moving across the city.
Greatly amplifies it, yes.
In a fraction of a second, a single weapon delivered the destructive force of an entire fleet of conventional bombers. The sequence of destruction happens faster than the human brain can even process. First is the thermal pulse.
The temperature at the hypocenter, which is the point on the ground directly below the detonation, reached thousands of degrees in an instant.
The flash of heat was so intense it bleached the concrete and left permanent shadows of people who were vaporized out in the open.
The immediate physical effects were catastrophic. An estimated 78,000 of Hiroshima's roughly 350,000 residents died instantly.
Within 0.6 miles of the hypocenter, there was almost total annihilation. Wood and paper structures were flattened instantly by the shockwave, and even heavier concrete structures were severely gutted.
Following the shockwave, the intense thermal pulse ignited thousands of secondary fires across the ruined city.
These fires quickly coalesced into a massive firestorm, very similar to what happened in Tokyo, which consumed much of what the blast wave had actually left standing.
And then there were the environmental effects, which introduced a completely new horror to warfare. Survivors described the phenomenon of black rain.
Because the explosion threw massive amounts of irradiated dust, ash, and pulverized debris high into the atmosphere.
Yes, and this material, mixed with the moisture of the rising mushroom cloud, cooled and fell back to Earth as a thick, sticky, highly radioactive black rain.
People who had survived the initial blast and the fires were completely covered in it.
Because the intense heat of the blast caused severe dehydration, many survivors were desperately drinking from rivers and open water sources.
Sources that were now heavily contaminated with this radioactive fallout.
The immediate aftermath in Tokyo really highlights the absolute totality of the weapon. As we discussed at the very beginning, the Japanese imperial headquarters initially experienced pure confusion.
They had reports of a bright flash and a loud explosion, but all communication links to Hiroshima had simply vanished simultaneously.
They could not comprehend it. They literally could not believe that a single attack, reportedly by only a few enemy aircraft, could silence an entire regional military hub.
That is why they sent that staff officer in the airplane. He flew toward Hiroshima expecting to find perhaps a downed communications relay or a localized fire.
Instead, he saw the burning ruins of an entire city from nearly 100 miles away.
He landed at a nearby naval base and finally managed to get a report back to Tokyo that Hiroshima had been destroyed by a single bomb of unprecedented power.
But even as the Japanese leadership struggled to gather information and comprehend the nature of the destruction at Hiroshima, the diplomatic and strategic situation deteriorated further.
And the second atomic blow was already in motion, though it would be heavily complicated by geopolitics, technical issues, and just local weather conditions.
August 9, 1945, brought a dual shock to the Japanese government that finally fractured their strategic deadlock.
Because in the early hours of the morning, just past midnight on August 9, the Soviet Union officially entered the Pacific War.
They launched Operation August Storm, which was a massive, highly coordinated invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. Over 1 million Soviet troops poured across the border, rapidly overwhelming the Japanese Kwantung Army.
This completely altered the strategic reality for Japan. For months, the civilian leaders in the Japanese government had been hoping that the Soviet Union, which was currently neutral in the Pacific conflict, might broker a negotiated peace between Japan and the United States.
They were banking their entire diplomatic strategy on Soviet mediation.
And then the Soviets just invade.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Japanese Supreme Council was suddenly facing compounded, insurmountable pressure. The diplomatic back channel they were relying on had just declared war on them and was actively destroying their armies in mainland Asia.
Simultaneously, they were dealing with the reports from the scientific survey team sent to Hiroshima, which were finally confirming that the United States did indeed possess a functional nuclear weapon.
While that Supreme Council, known as the Big Six, was meeting in a bunker in Tokyo, fiercely debating whether to accept the Potsdam terms or continue fighting, the second atomic mission was already underway.
The B-29 bomber, named Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, had taken off from Tinian.
Boxcar was carrying the Fat Man plutonium bomb. This weapon was even larger and more powerful than Little Boy. It weighed 10,800 pounds and measured nearly 11 feet long.
And this mission was plagued with issues from the very start. Before takeoff, they discovered a faulty fuel transfer pump,
meaning 600 gallons of fuel in the reserve tanks were trapped and unusable, which severely limited their flight time.
And when they reached the rendezvous point over the island of Yakushima, they failed to link up with one of their observation planes.
They wasted nearly 45 minutes circling and burning precious fuel waiting for a plane that wasn't there.
They eventually proceeded to their primary target for August 9, which was the city of Kokura, a major arsenal and industrial center.
However, when Boxcar arrived over Kokura, the bombardier could not see the target. The mission orders strictly required visual confirmation of the aim point before dropping the weapon. They were not permitted to bomb by radar.
The city was obscured by thick clouds and smoke, and the origin of that smoke highlights the incredible role of sheer chance in history.
Part of the smoke was drifting over from the conventional firebombing of the nearby city of Yawata the night before.
But another significant part of the cover was created intentionally by Japanese steel mill workers in Kokura.
Yes. They were burning coal tar specifically to create a smokescreen to hide their factories from American bomber formations.
Boxcar made 3 separate bombing runs over Kokura, spending nearly an hour trying to find a break in the smoke and clouds.
Anti-aircraft fire was beginning to zero in on them, and Japanese fighter planes were reported climbing to intercept.
With their fuel reserves critically low due to the broken pump and all the delays, Major Sweeney realized they could not wait any longer. They had to divert.
The actions of a few steel workers burning coal tar ultimately spared the city of Kokura. The crew abandoned the primary target and flew southwest toward their secondary target. They flew to Nagasaki.
Nagasaki was a major seaport and industrial center on the western coast of Kyushu. It was home to massive Mitsubishi heavy industry plants that produced ships and torpedoes.
When Boxcar arrived, Nagasaki was also covered in clouds.
Sweeney was running so low on fuel that he had decided they would have to drop the bomb by radar and immediately head for an emergency landing on Okinawa, violating the visual drop orders.
But at the absolute last moment, the bombardier, Kermit Behan, spotted a break in the cloud cover.
He saw the industrial valley of the city through the gap and released the Fat Man bomb. It detonated at approximately 1,650 feet above the Urakami Valley.
The physical layout of Nagasaki was very different from Hiroshima. Hiroshima was built on a relatively flat river delta, which allowed the blast wave to spread out uniformly in all directions.
Nagasaki was situated in a series of valleys divided by steep hills.
Those hills contained the blast to a certain extent. The ridges actually shielded significant portions of the city from the direct thermal and blast effects.
However, within the Urakami Valley itself, the topography amplified the destruction. It acted like a bowl that concentrated the shockwave.
The immediate blasts of August 6 and August 9 were over. The physical destruction of the cities was complete. But the human toll was only just beginning to be understood by the world.
When we look at the casualty records by the end of 1945, the estimates are staggering, and to this day, they remain difficult to quantify perfectly.
The official estimates generally state that roughly 140,000 people were dead in Hiroshima by the end of 1945. In Nagasaki, the estimate is roughly 74,000 dead.
And within those massive numbers, it is estimated that 38,000 children were killed across the two cities.
It's really important to note that those figures represent only the deaths up to the end of that first year.
They include the tens of thousands who died instantly in the flash and the blast, those who were trapped in the rubble and consumed by the firestorms, and those who succumbed to injuries in the chaotic weeks that followed.
But the atomic bomb introduced a lingering killer.
The survivors, known in Japan as the habakusha, meaning explosion-affected people, began to experience the onset of acute radiation syndrome.
This is a medical reality that doctors on the ground had absolutely no prior experience treating.
Radiation sickness created a terrifying new paradigm in human warfare. This was a weapon that continued to kill long after the explosion itself had faded, long after the fires were put out.
People who seemed physically unharmed in the days following the blast, people who had no burns and no broken bones, suddenly began falling desperately ill.
The doctors in the surviving hospitals were baffled. They were taking blood samples and finding that the patient's white blood cell counts were plummeting to almost zero.
Patients began losing their hair in clumps. They developed purpura, which are purple spots under the skin caused by internal bleeding.
They suffered from severe vomiting, fever, and just a complete collapse of their immune systems.
The radiation had fundamentally damaged their cellular structure, specifically targeting rapidly dividing cells in the bone marrow and the gastrointestinal tract.
This ongoing health crisis prompted decades of medical investigations. The United States government established the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, the ABCC, to study the survivors.
Over the ensuing decades, researchers documented significant, statistically undeniable increases in leukemia and solid cancers among the hibakusha.
They also spent years studying the tragic effects on brain development and the incidence of birth defects among children who were exposed to the radiation in utero.
The experiences of the hibakusha were initially subjected to strict censorship during the post-war Allied occupation of Japan. The American authorities restricted the publication of photographs and detailed medical accounts of the radiation effects.
It wasn't until journalists managed to circumvent these restrictions and report on the ground that the true reality of the atomic bomb reached the global public.
A pivotal moment in this public understanding was the work of the journalist John Hersey. In 1946, he published a massive article in The New Yorker, which actually took up the entire issue of the magazine, simply titled Hiroshima.
It was later published as a book. Hersey's brilliant approach was to focus on the intertwined, minute-by-minute stories of 6 specific survivors.
A clerk, a doctor, a tailor's widow, a German priest, a young surgeon, and a Methodist pastor.
By focusing on their personal experiences, he humanized the massive, abstract statistics. He forced the reader to understand what it actually felt like to be on the ground when the sky turned white.
It is also vital to note that the victims were not exclusively Japanese civilians. There were thousands of foreign victims, particularly Korean forced laborers.
Japan had brought tens of thousands of Koreans to the home islands to work in heavy military industries, including the factories in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
The mortality rate among these Korean laborers was exceptionally high, and for many years, these foreign victims were often left out of early memorials and official recognition by the Japanese government.
There were also Allied prisoners of war killed in the blasts. The military commands did not have perfect intelligence on the location of all POW camps.
There were British and Dutch soldiers, as well as American POWs, among them Navajo code talkers who perished in the bombings.
And within this vast landscape of survival and tragedy, there are the incredibly rare, almost impossible stories of the double survivors. Men like Tsutomu Yamaguchi.
His story anchors these massive statistics in a deeply personal narrative. It is a story that defies probability entirely.
Tsutomu Yamaguchi was a 29-year-old naval engineer working for Mitsubishi. He lived in Nagasaki with his wife and infant son, but he had been sent on a 3-month business trip to the shipyards in Hiroshima.
August 6th was supposed to be his last day in Hiroshima.
He was literally stepping off a tram on his way to the shipyard when the Enola Gay dropped little boy.
He was less than 2 miles from the hypocenter. The flash blinded him temporarily, and the shockwave blew him into a potato patch. He sustained severe burns on his left side and ruptured his eardrums.
But he survived the immediate blast. He spent the night in an air raid shelter in the ruined, burning city.
The next day, navigating through the apocalyptic landscape, past melted bodies and collapsed bridges, he managed to reach the train station.
Which was miraculously still operating trains out of the city. He caught a train back to his hometown of Nagasaki.
He arrived in Nagasaki on August 8, received medical treatment for his severe burns, and despite his injuries, he reported for duty at the Mitsubishi main office on the morning of August 9.
Just think about the sheer surrealism of this moment. At around 11 in the morning, on August 9, Yamaguchi is standing in his supervisor's office. He is covered in bandages. He is trying to explain the sheer destructive power of the bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima.
His supervisor is skeptical, telling him it is impossible for one single bomb to destroy an entire city, suggesting Yamaguchi must be confused by the trauma.
And at that exact moment, the Fat Man bomb detonated over Nagasaki.
The blast blew out the windows of the office and sent Yamaguchi flying across the room. Because of the reinforced concrete of the building and the distance from the hypocenter, he survived the second atomic blast in 3 days.
He lived to be 93 years old, becoming a vocal advocate for nuclear disarmament.
While the civilian population suffered the immediate and lingering aftermath of these 2 bombs, the military and diplomatic gears were turning rapidly.
The pressure on the Japanese government had reached a breaking point, but the United States was not waiting for an answer. They were already preparing a third strike.
That is a piece of the history that is often overlooked in the standard narrative. The U.S. had a third bomb, another plutonium Fat Man design, in production.
The plutonium core for this weapon, which later became infamously known as the Demon Core, was at Los Alamos, ready to be shipped to Tinian.
General Groves had issued a directive on July 23, stating that additional bombs would be delivered and used on Japanese targets as soon as they were available from the assembly line.
The industrial machinery of the Manhattan Project was geared for continuous production. They anticipated having a third bomb ready by late August and another 3 in September.
This raises the question of bureaucratic and military momentum. The military apparatus was set to deliver these weapons as they rolled off the assembly line. It was not a matter of pausing to assess the diplomatic situation after every drop. The standing order was to continue the strikes.
Exactly. Consider that momentum. Was the plan for a third bomb and the subsequent bombs a highly calculated strategic decision tailored to Japanese diplomatic signals? Or was it simply the result of an industrial assembly line that could not be easily stopped once it had been set in motion?
It was likely a combination of both. General Groves operated with the absolute mandate to end the war, and he viewed the continuous, unyielding application of nuclear force as the primary means to do so.
However, President Truman did eventually intervene and order a halt to further atomic bombings without his express presidential authorization, regaining civilian control over the weapon.
But before a third bomb could be shipped, the internal struggle in Japan finally reached its climax.
The Supreme Council was completely deadlocked 3-3 on whether to accept the Potsdam Declaration. The military hardliners, led by War Minister Anami, insisted on adding conditions.
demanding that there be no Allied occupation,
Yeah.
that Japan handle its own disarmament. The civilian leaders knew the Allies would never accept those terms.
To break this deadlock, Emperor Hirohito took an unprecedented step. Historically, the emperor acted as a silent figurehead, listening to the debates of his cabinet and merely ratifying their consensus decisions.
But in the sweltering bunker beneath the imperial palace, facing the reality of the atomic bombings and the rapid Soviet advance through Manchuria, he exerted his immense prestige.
He broke the silence, addressed the council, and declared that the unendurable must be endured. He ordered the government to accept the Potsdam terms.
But even the emperor's direct word didn't instantly stop the war machine. We often think of surrender as a simple signature on a document, but in Tokyo, it almost resulted in a civil war.
There was severe resistance from a small but highly dangerous group of younger military fanatic officers.
In the hours before the surrender was to be publicly broadcast, these hardliners, led by Major Kenji Hatanaka, attempted a military coup, an event known as the Kyujo Incident.
They assassinated the commander of the 1st Imperial Guards Division and seized control of the Imperial Palace grounds.
Their goal was to find the phonograph record. The emperor had recorded his surrender speech on a vinyl record, which was to be broadcast on the radio the next day.
The coup plotters tore through the palace, searching for the recording so they could destroy it and issue forged orders continuing the war.
The recording had been smuggled into the quarters of a lady-in-waiting and hidden in a small safe. The coup plotters failed to find it. They also failed to gain the support of the wider army command. By morning, the coup collapsed, and Major Hatanaka committed suicide.
On August 15, 1945, at noon, the Japanese people heard the emperor's voice for the first time in history over the radio.
In the dual voice broadcast, spoken in a formal, archaic court Japanese that many commoners struggled to understand, he announced the capitulation.
Noting famously that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and citing the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb.
The formal surrender was signed weeks later, on September 2, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
And the subsequent Allied occupation of Japan began. Henry Louis Stimson later noted in his writings that the occupation and disarmament of the Japanese home islands were completed with unprecedented ease and a surprising lack of armed resistance.
Stimson argued that this peaceful occupation proved that the atomic bombs served exactly the purpose intended. By shocking the system and demonstrating overwhelming godlike destructive power, they gave the Japanese Peace Party the definitive leverage needed to override the military hardliners.
Stimson maintained that the bombs brought the conflict to a sudden halt, avoiding a drawn-out, bloody insurgency that would have cost millions of American and Japanese lives.
The war was finally over. The guns were silent. But the debate over exactly how it ended, the necessity of that ending, and the profound moral cost of that ending was about to begin.
And it has not stopped since. We move into the enduring historical debate regarding the ethics, the legality, and the legacy of the bombings.
The historical debate generally centers on the absolute necessity of the bombings. The traditional justification, often associated with Stimson and later heavily promoted by President Truman, argues that the bombs saved millions of lives.
They point to the horrific casualties sustained during the recent battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa as definitive proof of what a mainland invasion would entail.
In this view, the atomic bomb was a tragic but necessary instrument to end a brutal war of aggression started by Japan.
On the other side of the spectrum, revisionist historians, gaining prominence in the 1960s with scholars like Gar Elperovitz, severely question that necessity.
They argue that Japan was already strategically defeated. The island nation was completely cut off by a tight naval blockade. They had no oil, no resources.
Their cities were heavily damaged by conventional bombing, and the population was on the verge of starvation.
The revisionist critique emphasizes that the entry of the Soviet Union into the war might have been enough on its own to force the surrender without the use of nuclear weapons.
They argue that the military planners knew Japan was seeking a way out through Moscow.
Some revisionists even argue that a primary motivation for dropping the bombs was not just to defeat Japan, but to demonstrate American military supremacy to the Soviet Union, essentially firing the first shots of the Cold War.
So, what does this all mean? How do we reconcile the cold, strategic military logic of the 1940s with the catastrophic human reality on the ground?
Moving beyond just the strategic necessity, there are profound ethical debates surrounding the deliberate, indiscriminate targeting of non-combatant civilians.
Total war, by its nature, relies on the destruction of civilian infrastructure to break the enemy's capacity to fight. But the application of a nuclear weapon takes this concept to an extreme.
It raises deep questions about the principle of proportionality in just war theory. Does the end ending the war quickly justify a means that involves vaporizing thousands of children in a fraction of a second?
It forces us to examine the very laws of war. There are significant legal considerations regarding the applicability of international frameworks, like the Hague Conventions, which prohibited the bombardment of undefended towns, to atomic warfare.
This raises an important question about how customary international law struggles to address entirely new categories of weapons. We see this play out legally in the post-war Shimoda case.
In 1955, a group of Japanese residents from Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought a compensation claim regarding the legality of the bombings against the Japanese government.
They had to sue their own government because Japan had waived all claims against the United States in the 1951 Treaty of San Francisco.
And the ruling in that case is fascinating. The district court in Tokyo delivered its judgment in 1963. They found that the atomic bombings did, in fact, violate the principles of international law regarding indiscriminate attacks on undefended cities.
However, because individuals do not generally have standing to make claims against the state in international law, the court denied the survivors the right to claim damages.
It was a symbolic legal victory, but a practical defeat for the survivors. But it cemented the legal argument that nuclear weapons violate the fundamental principles of distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants.
And the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki cast a massive, inescapable shadow over the rest of the 20th century. It fundamentally shaped global nuclear doctrine, the concept of mutually assured destruction, and the tense geopolitics of the Cold War.
The impartial, unalterable reality is that these two events are the only times nuclear weapons have been used in armed conflict.
They serve as the definitive, horrifying data points for both the military efficacy and the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear warfare. Every nuclear policy, every arms control treaty is informed by the ashes of those two cities.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that stretches beyond the immediate historical timeline we have discussed today. What happens to human psychology when the tools of destruction completely outpace our capacity to comprehend their effects until after they are deployed?
The scientists at Los Alamos knew the mathematical certainty of the yield. They knew the blast pressure.
But no one truly understood the lingering generational horrors of radiation sickness until the Hibakusha began to suffer and die in the hospital wards of Japan. Our technological capability vaulted ahead of our moral imagination. And today, as the survivors pass away and the living memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki slowly fades from the world, how does that memory continue to act as the primary emotional and psychological force holding together the fragile nuclear taboo in modern geopolitics? When the living memory is gone, does the taboo fade with it? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.